So when Republicans decided that we really don't think it's a good idea to manipulate courts this way, to populate them with partisans, to try court stacking for the purpose of advancing an agenda, that's when our Democratic friends decided to go nuclear. The pity of this is, you know, our founders had enormous foresight, absolutely brilliant. They constructed an incredible document, series of documents that have guided this republic for centuries now. And they anticipated a lot. I don't think they anticipated that the leader of the majority party in the United States Senate would just turn it over to the control of the executive branch and make this institution just a rubber stamp for what the president wants to do. But that's where we are. So now, what is the practical consequence of all this? Why is it that this is such a terrible idea? Let me touch on a few of the things. There's a lot of reasons, Mr. President, why I think this is disastrous policy, but let me touch on a few of them. One result of this is undoubtedly a further polarization, in fact, a radicalization of the federal government. A second is that as a direct result of this unilateral decision and the ability now of our Democratic friends to simply steamroll nominees through without any consideration by the minority party, we will have to expect fluctuations, volatility in administrative and regulatory rulings. And then lastly, and probably most disturbingly, I think there's a real danger that a justice system that has been the envy of the world and is recognized for its impartial and nonpartisan integrity may very well be increasingly viewed as a partisan and biased one. Let me explain these a little bit. The idea that we'd have a more radicalized federal government. For 200 years, a president has always known that in order to nominate and to get confirmed one of his nominees, he would need broad support in the United States Senate. It wouldn't fly if he selected someone who was only appealing to a few or even a very small majority. And so what does that do? That forces any president, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, to nominate people who would have that broader bipartisan appeal. And frankly, presidents of both parties are always under pressure from their respective bases to pick the most extreme people. That's what pleases the base of either party. And it's always served the republic well that a president could say, well, you know, I've got to get that person confirmed through the Senate. And if I pick the most extreme people, that's going to be a problem. The fact that a president has needed that bipartisan support has essentially required that a president look for people who represent a broad consensus across America. Now, in this post-nuclear Senate, that moderating influence is gone. There's no such influence anymore. And I think it's a safe bet that we can expect more extreme nominees. And we've already seen some evidence of it. The Hill ran a story recently. It reported that now that the nuclear option has been detonated, far-left interest groups are, quote, pressing President Obama to select left-wing nominees for key regulatory and judicial posts, nominees who could never have been confirmable before. Well, that's no surprise. That's exactly the kind of output, kind of consequence that we should expect from this. Second consideration is stability in rules and regulations that are promulgated by the various regulators and agencies. You know, I hear every day across Pennsylvania one of the grave concerns about business that is hampering our ability to have a stronger economy, to have the kind of growth that we'd like to have, is uncertainty about regulations. And it's true, and it's important. And guess what? It's likely to get worse because, first of all, this huge administrative bureaucratic state that we've devolved into recently touches on virtually every aspect of our life. And there are hundreds of agencies, boards, and commissions that the administration controls. Well, what's likely to happen now is that if the White House and control of the Senate changes parties, we're likely to see big swings in the ideology and the partisanship of these folks because they weren't consensus candidates in the first place, right? Given that now we've got a situation where a majority party just steamrolls their way through whomever they want and have every incentive to go to the extremes. When they lose an election, what are we going to have? We're going to have the exact opposite swing. And so for businesses trying to make a decision about whether or not to invest in America, to grow their company, to hire more workers, they're going to worry and wonder, well, what will the regulatory regime look like in just a few years, depending on how the election goes? There's much less predictability, less stability. And the direct result of that is going to be less investment and fewer jobs. This is not good news for our economy at all. And then finally, my concern is that for similar reasons, we're going to see a diminishing of the judiciary, of the status of the judiciary among the American people, of the credibility, the respect that the American people have had. I said a moment ago, I think one of the great strengths of the American federal government throughout our history has been that we have, generally speaking, there have been exceptions. There always will be some exceptions, but generally speaking, over time, by and large, at all the levels, American people have had a pretty high respect for the judiciary. They've respected the fact that our judges are capable and competent and tend not to be partisan hacks. They tend not to be polarized political figures trying to advance an agenda they have tended to be. Men and women of ability and integrity who are calling balls and strikes the way they see fit. They realize they're the umps, they're the referees, they're not players on the field. They're not there to advance an agenda, they're there to officiate based on the law and the Constitution. That's been the case. That's why our judiciary has been so respected, because it's nonpartisan, it's independent of the other branches of government, and it's behaved that way. And the confidence of the American people that they can go before a federal judge and receive a fair and unbiased hearing, whether they're a Democrat or a Republican, liberal or conservative. Fact is, most Americans don't worry first, well, wait a minute, is that judge a Republican? That doesn't occur to most people to ask that question, and nor should it, because it doesn't matter in most cases. And this respect for the judiciary the American people have is extremely important. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 78 talked about the importance of this deep respect for the judiciary. He said, and I quote, "The judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the three departments of power. Whereas the executive branch has the military and Congress has the power of the purse, the judiciary cannot enforce its own decisions. It relies on Americans' respect for it and willingness to enforce its rulings as essential." That was Alexander Hamilton. And the fact is that the deep respect that the American people have had for the judiciary has allowed our courts, including the Supreme Court of the United States, to issue decisions that have profoundly affected our lives, profoundly changed our society. So many times, so much for the better. A famous example would be Brown versus the Board of Education, which reversed the separate but equal doctrine. It ended the Southern government's laws that banned white and black persons from associating together. Now, this created a certain upheaval at the time, but it stuck. And part of the reason that it stuck was the public saw that this was a decision by this nonpartisan court that was acting as an arbiter of our Constitution. And the respect that the American people had for our courts was a big part of why a contentious decision quickly became accepted and became part of our fabric. Alexander Hamilton explained that the judiciary's integrity and independence are absolutely critical. Otherwise, Americans' confidence in the court will be replaced by what he described as universal distrust and distress. He said, and I quote, "The benefits of the integrity and moderation of the judiciary must have commanded the esteem and applause of all the virtuous and disinterested. Considerate men of every description ought to prize whatever will tend to beget or fortify that temper in the courts, as no man can be sure that he may not be tomorrow the victim of a spirit of injustice by which he may be the gainer today." And further quote from Alexander Hamilton, he said, "The inevitable tendency of such a spirit is to sap the foundations of public and private confidence and to introduce in its stead universal distrust and distress." Mr. President, when a president, with the cooperation of a legislature which rubber stamps judicial nominees for the purpose of ratifying a political agenda, when this happens, the American people's trust in the judiciary will be badly damaged. And we are at the threshold of that moment now. Of course, it also completely undermines our whole system of separation of powers. The fact is, when judges are seen as being at the beck and call of a legislature or a president or a party, our individual liberty is simply not secure. Again, to quote Hamilton, he said, "The general liberty of the people can never be endangered from the court so long as the judiciary remains truly distinct from both the legislature and the executive." He goes on to say, and I quote, "Liberty can have nothing to fear from the judiciary alone, but would have everything to fear from its union with either of the other departments." And when you have one party ruling this process, completely controlling this process, and controlling it for the purpose of advancing a partisan agenda, well, that strikes me as exactly the danger that Hamilton warned us of. So where does that leave us, Mr. President, in this regard? I don't think we're doomed here, but I do think it's very important that the American people rise up and make their objection to this clearly heard. I think it's important that the American people contact their members of Congress and exercise their ultimate control of this process at the ballot box and urge the Senate majority to give up its plan to pack the court, to use the courts to achieve a legislative agenda that they can't get through a duly elected Congress that represents the American people. Oh, and by the way, there's another big incentive for our friends to want to pack this D.C. Circuit Court, and that is because the front burner, the most prominent policy and political issue of the day is largely going to be litigated right there very soon. You see, it's the D.C. Circuit that is going to hear a very, very important case that goes to the heart of Obamacare. The D.C. Circuit is hearing a case about how the IRS has chosen to implement some rules. You see, the law is very, very clear. The law states unambiguously that the subsidies that Obamacare has designed for many people who buy health insurance through their exchange, those subsidies will only be available through the state exchanges. As you know, Mr. President, Obamacare contemplates two different categories of exchanges through which people are forced to buy the mandated insurance. There are state exchanges, and in those states that don't operate in exchange, there are federal exchanges. Well, the law says that the subsidies are available only for the people who purchase their health insurance through the state exchanges. What the administration is attempting to do is to completely disregard the law and make the subsidies available to people who buy through either the state exchange or the federal exchange. That's not what the law says. And I understand this administration routinely disregards the law, but that's what we have an independent judiciary for, to impose a check when they do this. There's a legal scholar who's following this case closely. His name is Mike Carvin, and he's explained what's going on here. And I will quote from his writings on this. He says, Congress knew that the federal government cannot require the states to establish or operate exchanges, so it offered subsidized insurance premiums for residents of states with state-operated exchanges to entice states to undertake this responsibility. Instead, fully 33 states, from Texas to Ohio, to President Obama's and Vice President Biden's home states of Illinois and Delaware, have said thanks, but no thanks. Instead, these refusenick states have chosen to shield their businesses and residents from the worst of the potential train wreck. Well, that creates a bit of a problem for the administration, because with so many states choosing not to participate in this disaster and having only a federal exchange, if they actually comply with the law that they signed, then there'd be a lot of people who wouldn't be eligible for the subsidy. So if the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals were to simply, follow the law, impose the law, then that would create a huge problem, which strikes me as yet another incentive for why perhaps we've gone through what we've gone through the last couple of weeks, because it's so important for our friends on the other side to get the decisions they want out of this court. All of which brings me to what we really ought to be working on. By the way, all of these nominees that are here before us tying us up this week, this is all entirely at the choosing of the majority leader. None of these are essential, none of these are urgent, none of these are emergencies. We could be passing legislation like our defense authorization legislation. We've got a budget deal that could be on the floor. We've got a farm bill that's overdue. We've got a lot of things that we could be doing. We could be trying to deal with the enormous problems caused by Obamacare, but we're not. We're dealing with nominees instead. But I think we ought to focus on the problems that Obamacare is causing. And it is, I will admit, it's hard sometimes to know where to begin because these problems are so huge. Let me just start with the taxes that Obamacare has been imposing on us, continues to impose on us. It's a pretty extraordinary list. But as best we could tabulate, there are something like 20 different taxes that were created as part of Obamacare, over $1 trillion worth of taxes to burden this economy, diminish our opportunities to grow and invest and create the jobs that we need just at a time when our economy is weak and needs an opportunity to recover. Instead, we saddle it with all of these taxes. We have, for instance, an excise tax on charitable hospitals. We have a tax in the form of the codification of the economic substance doctrine. It's a tax hike of $4.5 billion. It allows the IRS to disallow completely legal tax deductions. We have the black liquor tax hike, which is a tax increase on a type of biofuel. We have a tax on innovator drug companies, $2.3 billion annual tax on the industry. We have a Blue Cross Blue Shield tax hike, a special tax deduction in current law would only be allowed if 85% or more of the premiums were spent on clinical services. That's a tax increase. That went into effect in 2010. We have a tax on indoor tanning services. We have the taxes that took effect in 2011 There's the medicine cabinet tax. Americans are no longer able to use health savings accounts and flexible savings accounts or health reimbursement pre-tax dollars to purchase non-prescription over-the-counter medicines. So the inability to use these tax-spared accounts for legitimate medical needs, that's a tax increase. We have the HSA withdrawal tax hike. Going into effect in 2012, we had the employer reporting of insurance on W-2. In 2013, we got a surtax on investment income, a whole new 3.8% surtax on investment incomes, and this can only have the effect of diminishing investment in our economy. It diminishes the return on investment, diminishes the incentive to take a risk and start a new business, provide capital to a new business, grow a business, all part of Obamacare. We've got the hike in the Medicare payroll tax. And one of the most egregious of them all, we've got the tax on medical device manufacturers. Now this one is particularly egregious because it's so badly designed on top of being ill-conceived. I mean, this is a 2.3% tax on the sale of medical devices. This is irrespective of whether a company has any income whatsoever, makes any money from this. We're imposing a tax on the sale of these products. The average medical device company has a profit margin of less than 5%. 2.3% tax is about half of all their income that goes now to a new sales tax. And by the way, they still have to pay income taxes, all the ordinary income taxes. This is absolutely devastating because what these companies are then forced to do is virtually the entire bottom line goes for taxes. They don't have the money to reinvest in their business. The medical device industry is one of the best industries we've got in this country. It is so dynamic. It is so creative. Mr. President, I wish you could come with me to parts of Pennsylvania where this industry is just thriving, or was thriving, not so much anymore. It's thriving because of the creativity and the innovation and the devices, the inventions that people are making that are improving the quality of life, extending life. It's amazing what the marriage of technology and some creative minds and experts in healthcare, what they're creating. But unfortunately, a lot of these products, it takes a long time before they're actually profitable for the company that sells them, long after they've begun sales. This tax imposes the burden before they've ever become profitable. Well, what's the effect of that is it makes this whole industry less appealing to invest in, less attractive to entrepreneurs, to investors, whether it's venture capital or private equity or wherever the source might be. Guess what? Less is going to medical devices, an industry that's saving lives, improving the quality of our life. By the way, big manufacturing industry. Most of these companies manufacture their products in the United States, many in Pennsylvania. Oh, and by the way, we sell a lot of them overseas. We have a big trade surplus in medical devices because we lead the world in this. And what does Obamacare do? Slap a new tax on the sales. It's a terrible, terrible policy. We have a high medical bills tax. Currently, those people who face high medical bills are allowed a deduction for medical expenses to the extent that those expenses exceed 7.5% of adjusted gross income. The new provision, which took effect just earlier this year, raises that threshold before you can take that deduction. That's just a complicated, convoluted tax increase on people who have high medical bills. There's the flexible spending account cap, elimination of tax deduction for employer-provided retirement drug coverage in coordination with Medicare Part D. There's the individual mandate excise tax. There's the employer mandate tax. There's the tax on health insurers. There's an excise tax on comprehensive health insurance plans. Mr. President, this is 20 different taxes, the combined effect of which is without a doubt to significantly weaken our economy. But that's not the only way that Obamacare weakens our economy. You see, the mandate that Obamacare imposes on employers kicks in on employers who have 50 or more employees. Well, I can tell you, I have spoken with a number of Pennsylvania employers who have 45 or 47 or 48 employees. They're not subject to the hugely expensive mandates of Obamacare. And you know what they tell me? They're not going to be subject to it. They'll go to great lengths to avoid hiring the 50th employee. They'll hire temps. They'll pursue automation. They'll do all kinds of things that they wouldn't otherwise do because this government makes it too expensive for them to hire a 50th employee. At a time when our workforce participation rate is at a record low because so many people have given up even trying to find work, Obamacare makes it too expensive for employers to hire new workers. Oh, it has a similar effect on hours worked because this 50 employee count applies to anybody who works 30 hours or more. So one of the ways a business can avoid these crippling costs is cut back on the number of hours for their workers. Well, that doesn't work out so well for somebody who needs those hours to pay their bills, to support their family. It's happening all across the country. Another aspect that is really outrageous is this mandate in Obamacare that employers must, regardless of whether the employees want it or not, they must provide contraceptive and abortifacient coverage. Now, one of the problems with this is that these services run completely contrary to deeply held religious views for a lot of people, faith-based institutions and others. So the administration decided, well, they'll offer an accommodation for faith-based institutions. The accommodation that they offered is pure sophistry. What they offered was to say, well, you won't have to, you, the faith-based institution, you won't have to actually pay for those services which you find objectionable based on your faith. You won't have to pay for them, but you have to buy an insurance plan that has them, and the insurance company will just have to give you that for free. This is the most ridiculous thing in the world. Private companies aren't in the business of offering their services for free. If there's an aspect of it that they have to supposedly give away, then they're simply going to pass on the cost for other services that they provide. Nobody's fooled by this. This is just yet another of the details of Obamacare. But really some of the biggest problems I've saved to the end, Mr. President, and that's the series of broken promises that Obamacare constitutes. And one of the most glaring is this promise that we heard, I don't know how many times we heard it, but we all did. We heard the President say, and so many of our Democratic colleagues who support this bill, they said that if you like your health plan, you can keep your health plan. Now, Mr. President, let's be very clear. Everybody who supported this bill, who is familiar with it, and that would certainly include the President of the United States and our friends here, they knew from the beginning that that was not possible. And they knew that because the legislation was designed to prevent many people from keeping their health insurance. It was written for that purpose in part because they had to. The whole point, a big part of the point of Obamacare was to establish standards that the government determined were appropriate for, regardless of whether an individual American thinks that a given plan is adequate or not, or suitable for herself or her family. It was up to the government to make this decision, not the individual. And they would establish criteria, and if your plan didn't meet the criteria, your plan was going to be canceled. That's in the legislation. That is codified. It always was. It's at the heart of this legislation. So for anybody to go around the country saying, if you like your health plan, you can keep your health plan, well, they were knowingly stating something that was completely untrue, was always untrue, and was necessarily untrue. And the examples abound. Mr. President, I've got emails from constituents. I've got too many. I won't have a chance to run through them all this evening. I might have to come back on another occasion. But I'll share a few with you. This is from a small business owner from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I got this just I think I got this earlier today, and I'll just quote from this email from my constituent addressed to me. It says, as my congressional representative, you need to know how Obamacare is harming my life and health care. I work for a small construction company. My cost for family health care was already over $11,000 per year. We received notification that our policy was being canceled since it did not comply with requirements of the Affordable Care Act. Our company looked for the best rates they could find for comparable coverage, which did comply. They chose a new insurance company. We just recently were given the costs for next year. My cost to cover myself and my family will be over $17,500 per year, a 59% increase. Even with that, the deductibles and out-of-pocket maximums are higher. This is not affordable care. This would eat up a major part of my income. I attempted to log on to the healthcare.gov website several times, but always get kicked out. I do not hold much hope that I'll get any better rates because I don't qualify for a credit. We were already struggling to live on my take-home pay. We cannot afford to have it reduced by over $6,500. We may have to drop health coverage for my wife or kids and pay the penalty. I suspect that this law will result in many more people losing their health care at the expense of a few getting free or reduced cost health care. I got this just a week ago from a man from Cumberland County, Pennsylvania. He said, my wife Barb and I have been trying for almost 3 weeks now to get signed up. All income and health info and private information is on the unsecured website and the application is accepted, but we've not been able to get on to pick the plan or get our price, so nobody's been paid. Thus, our canceled insurance ends on December 31st, and we look to be out. A big mistake by the folks that voted for this. I've had cancer a couple of times. My wife has had cancer, and we both see our doctors when needed. This ACA will ruin many families if we can't get on an insurance plan. I had a woman from Lebanon County, Pennsylvania, sent me this email a week ago. She said, we had our health care discontinued, and after an appeal, we were able to get it reinstated, but only for this year. Currently, we have a health care savings plan with a deductible of $3,000 a year. In the new plan, our deductible would increase to $12,000 and our premiums would increase to $9,000 a year. How is a middle-class married family supposed to pay for this? This is absolutely ridiculous, and this is our situation. I hope every government worker has to purchase their plan through this plan. Here's another. A man from Delaware County in southeastern Pennsylvania. I'm 66 and I'm on Medicare. My wife is 63. Her insurance company canceled her long-standing policy due to the requirements of the ACA. Her new policy costs $350 more per month. We're on a strict budget. We're the hardworking middle class. Who stands for us? There's another promise we frequently heard, and that promise we frequently heard was that if you like your doctor, you'll be able to keep your doctor. This, too, Mr. President, was known to be impossible. Since the law was designed to discontinue health insurance plans and force people onto alternative plans, not all plans cover the same doctors. Certainly some were going to lose their coverage. Let me give you an example of an email I got from a woman from Westmoreland County just last week. She writes, I've been self-employed for 13 years and have never been without health insurance. 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Having an expensive pre-existing condition was not a problem for me, as I had never let my insurance lapse. My medication costs without insurance, $4,000 per month. I received notice several weeks ago that they would now cancel my plan and would do so as of January 1st, and I had to sign up for new coverage through the health insurance exchange. So my staff reached out to this woman and tried to help, and after several attempts, she was able to access the exchange. You know what she learned? She learned that in her region, there were two options available to her. One, Mr. President, covers her doctors who've been treating her for her MS for years. The other covers her prescription drugs, and neither one covers both. This is the kind of decision that people are being forced to make all over America. It's the kind of decisions that people are being forced to make every day. It is a direct result of the loss of personal freedom that this legislation imposes on people, and this is the topic that we ought to be addressing in this body so that we can, frankly, the only solution, which is to repeal this bill and move health care in a completely different direction. I believe, Mr. President, that my time has expired, so I will, this time I will yield the floor.
The Senator from New York.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, and I rise to speak about a particular incident that occurred in Webster, New York, a beautiful town near the city of Rochester. On Christmas Eve 2012, nearly 1 year ago today, the 125-member West Webster Volunteer Firemen's Association, a volunteer fire department east of Rochester, New York, faced an unimaginable tragedy when 4 of their brave members were wounded, 2 fatally, when they responded to a fire, but instead faced an ambush of unspeakable proportions. While many families across our nation were waking up last Christmas Eve morning to finish preparing Christmas dinner, shopping, wrapping presents, picking up the family from the airport, 4 Webster families were instead confronting a heart-wrenching tragedy. The call of a house on fire came into the West Webster Fire Department at 5:30 a.m. on December 24th. And although it was a cold, snowy morning, still dark before the sun rose, everyday heroes from the West Webster Fire Department courageously did what they volunteered to do on behalf of their neighbor and behalf of their hometowns. They, like millions of brave volunteer firefighters throughout our country and throughout its history, left their homes and their families in safety to put out a fire that always creates danger. This routine call turned into a tragedy which shocked the community, people throughout the country, and even people throughout the world. Firefighter Joseph Hofstadter, a 14-year volunteer for West Webster, arrived first on the scene. Firefighter Theodore Scardino arrived soon after, with Lieutenant Mike Ciparini in a pumper truck, followed by 19-year-old firefighter Tomasz Kachuka, driving the department's SUV. What they didn't know was that the fire was intentionally set by the home's owner in order to lure these innocent firefighters into a senseless sniper ambush. The sniper was hiding behind a berm amidst the chaos of the fire and began shooting at the responding firefighters. The firefighters were confused at first to hear popping sounds and thought it might be from the fire. But Lieutenant Mike Ciparini, who was also a Webster police officer, knew better and shouted to his fellow office volunteers to take cover. But unfortunately, Mr. President, it was too late. Firefighter Hofstadter was shot in the pelvis while trying to alert dispatchers on the radio to the situation. Ted Scardino was shot in the shoulder, and 5 minutes later, shot again in the leg. The 16-year volunteer lay there while bleeding for over an hour, enduring the December cold while sustaining second-degree burns on his head as the fire now spread to consume 6 other neighboring homes. Lieutenant Ciparini and firefighter Kachuka both died in the ambush. As news of this horrific, senseless Christmas Eve tragedy spread, well-meaning people from across the Rochester and Finger Lakes area, across New York State, across the nation and the world, reached out to the West Webster Volunteer Firemen's Association to offer support and prayers. Thousands of incredibly generous people flooded the department with countless financial contributions to support the volunteer department, to support the 4 firefighters, and in the case of Lieutenant Ciparini and firefighter Kachuka, to support the families they had left behind. Not realizing that collecting and distributing the funds to the families would jeopardize the association's tax-exempt status with the IRS, the association accepted donations from generous people all around the nation wanting to help the 4 families who suffered the most on that day. They collected these donations for the victims, for their families, and they want to give these donations to the victim and their families. It defies reason that they'd be unable to do so now because of a technicality in the tax code. And just as we did after 9/11, and again after a similar fire department tragedy in California in 2006, it's our obligation to make sure the West Webster Volunteer Firemen's Association can now disperse to these families the contributions that their neighbors and unknown countless generous others wanted them to have. As it is, the disbursement of these funds have been delayed for months and now almost a year. And that's why I'm asking the Senate to proceed with consideration of the Fallen Firefighters Assistance Tax Clarification Act. The proposal merely clarifies, as it did after 9/11, and again after the California tragedy in 2006, that the West Webster Volunteer Fire Department will not lose its status as a nonprofit by distributing the donations to these firefighters and their families. As we again enter the Christmas season and approach the one-year anniversary of this tragedy, now's the time to make this right. We need to do it on behalf of the families of the fallen and the injured. The family of 43-year-old Lieutenant Mike Ciparini includes his wife Kim, his 19-year-old son Nick, and his daughters, 4-year-old Casey and 3-year-old Kylie. Known to many as Chip, Lieutenant Ciparini was a West Webster Department volunteer firefighter for 25 years. He was past chief of the West Webster Fire Department and advisor of its Fire Explorer post. He also served with distinction for 19 years as a police officer with the West Webster Police Department and rose through the ranks as a dispatcher, police officer, investigator, sergeant, and lieutenant. In short, he committed his entire life to public service for the town of Webster. Likewise, 19-year-old firefighter Tomas Kachuka left behind his parents, Janina and Marianne Kachuka, along with his older twin brothers and a large extended family. Firefighter Kachuka was selflessly devoted to his family and community. In fact, he wasn't even supposed to be on duty that Christmas Eve, but elected to make the shift so that older department members could be home with their families that day. And the surviving firefighters, Ted Scardino and Joseph Hofstetter, have had to endure long rehabilitations for their injuries. Their families have had to deal with life's ordinary challenges and day-to-day expenses as Ted and Joe recover and move forward with their lives. The fact is, Mr. President, that ordinary Americans, moved by the heroic sacrifice of these volunteer firefighters, have offered generous support. They have intended their contributions to help these families in the wake of the tragedy and in recognition of the service of these brave firefighters. These were volunteer firefighters, volunteers. I know many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle are well acquainted with the volunteer fire service. Many even may have a membership in the volunteer fire company themselves. You all know men and women just like the members in West Webster. They're the epitome of the American spirit. The French observer de Tocqueville was taken by that spirit when he visited America and the Rochester area in 1831 and thought volunteerism was one of the things that set America apart from the rest of the world. That was true then. It is still true today. These heroes don't ask for anything. They just want to protect their neighbors and their community. It's just plain wrong that they would lose their not-for-profit status simply for being a pass-through to convey donations to these families after an unspeakable tragedy. And in that same spirit, Mr. President, tonight I had hoped to request unanimous consent this evening to move forward with the consideration of this legislation. Who could object? Who could object? However, I understand that some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle object to me making the request at this time. Therefore, I will withhold that request this evening and sincerely hope my colleagues will think about this overnight and allow us to proceed with consideration tomorrow. it is indeed the right thing to do. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the comments of my colleague from New York City, who's been a tireless champion for the terrific, dedicated, self-sacrificing firefighters of New York City. Tonight we're here on the floor addressing the question of whether we should confirm Cornelia Pillard as a candidate for the D.C. Circuit Court. She is a law scholar with a long track record of public service. She served twice in the Justice Department and successfully defended the Family and Medical Leave Act, a crucial piece of legislation for working families. She now teaches law at Georgetown University, one of the top law schools in the nation. The truth is, she's an extremely well-qualified nominee who will be an excellent addition to the D.C. Circuit Court. She has personally argued and briefed Supreme Court cases brought or defended by government lawyers from Republican administrations. And Republican-appointed justices have often authored majority opinions in her favor. She is currently the co-director of the Supreme Court Institute at Georgetown Law, where she personally assists lawyers preparing for the Supreme Court on a pro bono, first-come basis without regard to which side they represent. In fact, Professor Pillard chaired the American Bar Association Reading Committee that reviewed Samuel Alito's writings during his nomination process for the Supreme Court. Her committee's assessment led the ABA to give Justice Alito their highest rating of well-qualified. Professor Pillard's unbiased approach to the law has won the respect of her colleagues in law and in government, including former Department of Justice officials and Republican administrations who have endorsed her nomination to the D.C. Circuit. In short, Professor Pillard is a fair-minded, highly accomplished litigator with an outstanding reputation for public service. Then why are we here now, after midnight, carrying on this debate? And to get to the root of that question, we have to examine the dysfunction that's present here in the U.S. Senate. Virtually all Americans know that Congress is not working well. Virtually all Americans know that the U.S. Senate is broken. Now, I saw a poll that said 92% of Americans believe that Congress is dysfunctional. And I wondered, what's wrong with the other 8%? They must not be paying attention. Because what we have experienced here in the U.S. Senate is a continuous campaign of obstruction and paralysis of the normal proceedings. No, there was a time when we had a Senate that had a core principle, which was up and down votes with rare exception. Up and down votes with rare exception. That was the tradition of the U.S. Senate. And that tradition really was rooted in the courtesy of hearing out every senator who wished to share their opinion on a topic before the Senate would make a decision. Now, maybe that was something easier to do when there were only 26 members of the Senate. We now have 100 members of the U.S. Senate. So maybe it takes a while to hear the opinions of every member, but still that courtesy has been honored through the years. But the counterpart to that is that folks knew in the end the Senate, with very rare exception, would get to a simple majority vote. The entire structure of our Constitution and the vision of our founders was that this body would make decisions with a simple majority vote. Recall, if you will, that the founders put into the Constitution special occasions for a supermajority. Now, those special occasions were things such as overriding a presidential veto. Those special occasions were things such as reviewing a treaty. But they envisioned a simple majority vote for the legislature because they felt that the majority decision most of the time would be a better direction to go than the minority opinion. That's the principle of democracy. The direction that most senators believe is the correct direction is the basis for going forward. Well, this principle has been completely lost in the last few years. A small group of senators here decided that they should replace the constitutional principle of a simple majority with a supermajority, that virtually every action would be subject to a requirement to have 60 votes to close debate rather than the constitutional 51. Now, this has been applied in ways that American citizens can't even imagine. Let's take motions to proceed. Now, a motion to proceed simply says, it's time to take up this bill. Let's vote yes or no on taking up this bill. That's a motion to proceed. But in recent times, the minority has said, you know what, we can use this motion to proceed as an opportunity to paralyze the Senate. We can object to having that simple majority vote, and then we can deny there being this supermajority to close debate, even if we have nothing to say, and we can simply waste the Senate's time on debating whether to debate. I've argued for a long time that this abuse must end. It is time to get rid of the filibuster on this motion to proceed, but nonetheless we have it, and my colleagues in this permanent campaign to paralyze the Senate have chosen to exercise this filibuster, if you will, this supermajority requirement, simply on a motion to debate an issue, as opposed to actually being in debate. Or let's take conference committees. It was extraordinarily rare for conference committees, the formation of them, to be subject to a supermajority in the history of the U.S. Senate. Conference committees were very common in the 70s and 80s. I was first here as an intern in 1976 with Senator Hatfield, and was here on Capitol Hill working for Congress in the 1980s. And if one chamber of Congress and the other chamber had reached a common, had both passed a bill, well then automatically you had a conference committee meet and resolve the differences. That's just common sense. Why would you delay that for a second? But when I came to the U.S. Senate in 2009 as a senator, I was mystified to discover that conference committees were not being held. So I inquired why that was. And the answer was that the minority had decided to use the filibuster, the supermajority, on establishing a conference committee. In other words, block the House and Senate from even talking to each other to resolve differences between two bills. And that drove the debate out of the public realm, in a public room, with a TV camera, into private discussions as negotiators tried to resolve and develop a common version of the bill. Well, there too, I've proposed that we need to get rid of this filibuster on conference committees. It is disrespectful of the most valuable commodity of this body that its time is wasted on filibusters on whether to start a discussion with the House when both the House and Senate have passed a version of the bill. And then, of course, we have the ongoing campaign of subjecting virtually every nomination to a supermajority. Well, in fact, in the history of the United States of America, in the entire history before President Obama, only 3 times was there a filibuster of a district court nominee. But in the time that President Obama has been in office, we've had 20 filibusters of district court nominees. Only 3 in our history until President Obama was president, and then 20 filibusters when he became president until now. 20 out of 23. That's just pure deliberate campaign of paralysis and obstruction, undermining the contribution of this body, its responsibility as a legislative body. And it just isn't judicial nominees, it's executive nominees as well. In our entire history as a nation, 168 nominations have been filibustered. 168 in our entire history. 82 of them have been nominations by President Obama. 82 nominees just in the 5 years President Obama's been in office out of the 168 in our entire history. So we see, whether we are looking at motions to proceed or conference committees or judicial nominees or executive nominees, a campaign of deliberate paralysis and obstruction rather than a dedication to serving our nation as the Constitution requires. Indeed, some have justified this ongoing paralysis. Some of my colleagues have said, but remember, President Washington said that the U.S. Senate should be a cooling saucer. Our concept is that you have a cup of hot tea and it's too hot to drink, you pour it into a saucer, it cools, and then it's just right. Well, President Washington would never recognize this strategy of obstruction and paralysis as legitimate under the U.S. Constitution. And indeed, there were elements designed to make this body deliberative. But there's a difference between deliberation and the destruction of the legislative process. There is a difference between a cooling saucer, thoughtful deliberation, and a deep freeze. But certain members of this body have decided they've not come here to fulfill the constitutional vision of the U.S. Senate as a deliberative body. They instead have come here to paralyze the function of this body, to obstruct this body. So there we saw it in the filibusters of the conference committee, in the filibusters of the motions to proceed, in the filibusters of the executive branch nominees, filibusters of the judicial nominees, and of course the filibusters of legislation, who have reached extraordinary levels never seen in the history of our nation. Now, just a little while ago, one of my colleagues chose to quote Alexander Hamilton in defense of this strategy of paralysis. Well, I would encourage my colleague to actually read more of Alexander Hamilton, because he actually directly addressed this question of filibusters and the potential to obstruct the will of the majority. And what did Alexander Hamilton say? He said, the real operation of the filibuster, quote, is to embarrass the administration, to destroy the energy of government, and to substitute the pleasure, caprice, and artifices of a insignificant, turbulent, or corrupt junto to the regular deliberations and decisions of a respectable majority. And he went on to say, when the majority must conform to the views of the minority, the consequence is, and I quote, tedious delays, continual negotiations and intrigue, contemptible compromises of the public good. Well, that's a pretty good description of what Americans see happening in this chamber as a result of this deliberate campaign of paralysis and obstruction. Tedious delays, continual intrigue, contemptible compromises of the public good. Now, many in this chamber have tried to reason and convey to members that we should return to the tradition of the Senate, up and down votes with rare exception. In 2005, it was the Democrats who were in the minority, and it was the Republicans who were in the majority. And at that time, the Democrats decided to filibuster a series of judicial nominees. So this is certainly a tactic employed by both Democrats and Republicans. Well, our Republican friends who were in the majority said that's not acceptable. They said that's not consistent with the philosophy of up and down votes with rare exception. They said that's not consistent with the power invested in the Constitution and the President to be able to place forth his nominees for consideration under the advice and consent clause of the Constitution. And our Republican colleagues were persuasive, and the Democrats in the majority agreed not to filibuster judges except under rare exceptions, exceptions of extraordinary flaws of character and experience. Well, then the clock turned. We came to 2009. Now we have a Democratic president, a Democratic majority, and the deal that was cut in 2005, agreed to by both sides, that there would be only rare filibusters based on exceptional flaws of character or experience, disappeared. It disappeared completely. The new minority did not honor the deal that had been negotiated in 2005. So come January 2011, there was a debate on this floor about trying to again restore the traditional understanding, up and down votes with rare exception, and there was a deal made, and it didn't last but a few weeks. So then there was another attempt in January 2013, and on this occasion, there was a promise made on the floor of the U.S. Senate. The minority leader came to the floor and said, the Republicans will return to the norms and traditions of the U.S. Senate regarding nominations. What are those norms and traditions? Those norms and traditions are a simple majority vote with rare exception. Well, within weeks, that promise was completely shattered. The first ever filibuster in U.S. history of a defense nominee, ironically a former colleague from the Republican side of the aisle. And then we had 43 senators write a letter and say they would not allow anyone to be confirmed for the position as director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Certainly inconsistent with up and down votes, with rare exception for issues of character. Well, then there was another big effort in July 2013, just earlier this year. We all got together in the old Senate chamber. We shared our frustrations and our views. And again, the promise was put forward. We will stop filibustering except under rare circumstances related to character or qualifications. Well, that was terrific. We had confirmation of the person, individual waiting to be director of the Environmental Protection Agency, Gina McCarthy. We had confirmation of the person who had been waiting for a very long time as nominee of Labor Department, Tom Perez. We had the confirmation of the folks who had been waiting to be confirmed to the National Labor Relations Board. In fact, I think we had the first time that we had all 5 members, Senate confirmed in 10 years. We had the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Richard Cordray, was finally confirmed. Shortly thereafter, we had Samantha Powers confirmed to the United Nations, and so forth. The norm was restored, but only for a couple weeks. And then came the nomination of Mel Watt to be at the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And suddenly the commitment to up and down votes disappeared. And then we had a whole new strategy on the judiciary. Now, this strategy had never been experienced in U.S. history. And it was, no matter who President Obama nominates for the D.C. Circuit Court, we are going to block that nominee because we only want to leave in place the nominees that were put in place by President Bush. Well, that's a direct contravention of the vision of the Constitution, where each president, as elected, has the power to nominate. This chamber is a check. It gets to vote up or down and decide whether or not they should be in office. But this was a deliberate strategy to pack the court, to say that when a president of my party is in power, there will be up and down votes, as was insisted in 2005 when the tables were turned. But when the president is of the other party, we're going to have a perpetual campaign, and we are going to block up and down votes. Now, let's picture down the road, and the new president is a Republican president. Is there truly any member here who would say from the Republican side that when the Republican president is in place, that they were still going to believe they shouldn't fill vacancies on key courts around this country? Well, it is too bad that this campaign of paralysis has been allowed to go on so long. We should have acted long before to fulfill our responsibility to have a deliberative body, because that's what a legislation is. You know, it's doing enormous damage to the United States of America. First, because of this paralysis, we're not doing the work that we should be on legislation. We're not addressing the big issues facing America. There are all kinds of job creation bills that have not been able to get to this floor because they haven't been able to get through the gauntlet of paralyzing filibusters that have been laid down. You know, Americans actually want to work. Americans want to have living wage jobs, and they expect us to act to make that happen, not to paralyze this institution so that it is unable to do so. Well, indeed, in addition, we are damaging the view of the United States around the world. Because it used to be the world looked to the U.S. and said, look how well their Congress works. They had this Great Depression, and they took on and fixed all kinds of flaws in their financial system. They established insurance for bank accounts so it wouldn't be runs on the bank. They replaced a flawed mortgage strategy which involved callable balloon mortgages with non-callable, fully amortizing mortgages so that we didn't create a series of dominoes. They took and created an organization, the Securities Exchange Commission, to oversee stock markets so that folks could have faith investing in stocks and could put their capital in knowing that there was a very good chance that capital would be well utilized because there were accounting standards and qualifications that blocked predatory practices on Wall Street. And then the world saw the U.S. respond to World War II, convert our economy through enormous amounts of legislation in a single year to apply it to the war effort and take on the big challenge of defeating the Nazis. And then the world saw America use its legislative power to build the largest middle class the world has ever seen. Those living wage jobs, every one of them means a foundation for a family. If you want to talk family values, then fight to have this body, this Senate, work on legislation that creates living wage jobs. Quit paralyzing the Senate. Then we have, of course, the fact that this new strategy, just in these recent months, it's a deliberate attack on the balance of powers. The Constitution envisioned 3 branches in balance. It has no hint of any kind that a minority of one branch should be able to undermine the operation of the other 2 branches. But some colleagues have seized upon a strategy of trying to undermine the integrity of our judiciary. Some colleagues have seized on a strategy of trying to undermine the capability of the elected executive branch, the President and his executive branch. Read your history. Balance of powers, not the ability of a minority of one branch to undermine the success of the other 2 branches. We need these 3 branches, each doing their assigned roles. So here we are now, after this long set of strategies of paralysis on motions to proceed, on legislation, on conference committee, on executive branches, nominees, on judicial nominees. We've taken the first step towards restoring the function of the U.S. Senate and said we should return to the notion of up and down votes as envisioned under advice and consent, as envisioned by Alexander Hamilton and the other founders who railed against the notion that a minority would be able to block the will of the majority in a chamber. And so we have done that with nominations. And in a continuation of a strategy of paralysis, we are here tonight rather than having voted much earlier in the day. And instead of being here working on legislation that would create jobs, we are standing here through a series of nominations as a minority insists on wasting the valuable commodity of time of this chamber. I hope that my colleagues who are intent upon creating this huge imbalance between the branches will reconsider, that they will decide they want to see this chamber become what it was when I was first here in the 70s and when I worked for Congress in the 80s, a great deliberative body. What it was when we took on the Great Depression, what it was when we took on World War II, what it was when we built the great middle class. That's what the United States wants to see. May we make it so. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. To change the rules, our friends on the left had to break the rules. Mr. President, we're here tonight because the Obama administration and our friends on the left